Hi, everybody. My name is Barbara Sherman, and I just wanted to say it's a great honor to introduce Mark Corske, who has written an incredibly deep book called Engines of Domination. And I have the pleasure of knowing Mark because he taught both of my children at Chimisa Mesa and continues to teach my daughter calculus. But he's an incredibly deep and unique thinker that has a very significant point of view that he's going to be sharing with us all right now. Please give a hand for Mark.
Thank you all so much for coming. If you knew how much it meant to me. This night's been coming a long, long, long time. I suppose I should tell a joke to start with?
Yeah.
This is a serious talk.
Yeah.
Did you hear the one about the philosopher who laughed at his own jokes? It wasn't funny. I'm told you should only make a few points in a talk or you'll lose everybody. But I think that's an insulting idea. If my best professors in college had done that, I wouldn't have learned anything from it. What they did was pour out a flood of fascinating ideas that made me think in new ways and left me eager to learn more. And that's what I am going to do with you tonight. The heart of my book, Engines of Domination, is a theory of political power. I'm going to tell you the two big ideas in my theory, not just a few choice clips like a movie trailer. If this talk makes those ideas clear and provokes a good discussion and leaves you eager to learn more, I will be overjoyed. After all, I want you to read the book. So, let's begin with a short Socratic dialogue. This particular fragment was never discovered previously because it didn't exist until I wrote it. And I won't apologize for putting my own ideas in the mouth of Socrates. Plato mastered that art thousands of years ago, which Gabrielle Herbertson's going to join me in doing the dialogue.
Socrates, I despair for the world.
Calm yourself, my dear Hypatia. You look as if you just met Medusa herself. Why do you despair for the world?
The oracle let me look through her time machine, and I saw the world that awaits us 2,000 years ahead. Wars that make Troy look like child's play, weapons that can set the world ablaze, machines eating jungles and mountains alive, poisons filling the air, land, and sea. There is no hope for us, Socrates.
Surely hope remains, Hypatia. Even the worst of times have given way to better ones.
No, Socrates, I am certain of it. Only a malignant creature could wreak such havoc upon the world. We are doomed.
Those are strong words, Hypatia. Please tell me the reasoning that makes you so certain of your conclusion.
Very well. If you look at any creature acting naturally in its habitat, then surely you see its nature in its action. Agreed?
Agreed.
Then does it not follow that when we look at our species acting in its habitat, we see its nature too? Does it not follow that the disasters I saw in the time machine show our violent and destructive nature?
I accept your first conclusion, Hypatia, but not your second one. Before we continue our conversation, perhaps we should go and ask the oracle to let me look through her time machine. She owes me a favor from long ago.
Very well, Socrates. Let us go then.
I see what you saw, Hypatia, and it brought tears to my old eyes. But I do not share your despair. When I looked closely, I did not see our species acting naturally in its habitat.
And what do you mean, Socrates? Are your eyes failing you?
Not yet, my dear. What I saw were great multitudes of men and women toiling at work that caused the destruction. Yet I saw that these multitudes were controlled by very small groups of men who did not share in the work, men in strange dark tunics with thin scarves tied around their necks. Without this control, The toiling multitudes would never have caused such destruction. The destruction clearly resulted from the institutions that these men commanded, not from human nature.
I saw this too, Socrates, but surely it must be human nature to live under such institutions. We do so even today here in Athens, as do civilized people throughout the world.
We do indeed, Hypatia. But you must not leap to the conclusion that this is human nature. Perhaps the oracle would be kind enough to turn a time machine backward for a moment, so we can see the world as it was 4,000 years ago.
Socrates, what was this? The Golden Age? Where were the palaces, the temples and fortresses? Where were the rulers living in luxury, the armies and the slaves?
Indeed, Hypatia, none of those existed in that time. And as you saw, the people were not living in squalor and violence. Those sheep grazing the lush green fields, the towns and villages, the trade ships, the caravans, this was a world every bit as civilized as ours, thriving without rulers and their destructive institutions. Yet these people were human beings just like ourselves. Therefore, the institutions that we saw destroying that future world must result from something other than human nature.
But what else could it be, Socrates? Surely our institutions must become destructive when societies grow and mature, the way a young man's face sprouts a beard.
That is possible, Hypatia, but I believe there is another explanation, one that allows us to keep our faith in human nature, and therefore our hope. When you watched that ancient society at work, did you see what made it possible? What made it more than small tribes, like those that still wander in the mountains today, foraging and hunting for a meager living?
You must mean the fields and livestock, Socrates.
I mean that and more, Hypatia. The fields did not grow themselves. The sheep did not gather themselves into tamed flocks. They were deliberately tamed and cultivated by the people. And the people could only do this through brilliant innovations, with the help of ingenious tools, the plow and shepherd's crook. What makes the shepherd different from the sheep is his knack for making tools and harnessing external sources of energy. That is truly human nature, Hypatia, our species acting naturally in its habitat.
I wish I could think so, Socrates, but this world did not last. Human nature brought forth rulers and slaves, the walled city, and war. How can you deny this?
Something brought them forth, Hypatia, and what did so was certainly human action, so it was something that was possible to human nature. Let us look more closely at those traits that set the shepherd apart from the sheep, making tools and harnessing external sources of energy. Suppose for a moment that some restless shepherd sat atop a hill, gazing down at the scene we just saw. He admired the great advantage that he and his people enjoyed from having cultivated the crops and tamed the animals. He watched the people in the fields and villages working at their tasks, drawing this bounty from nature. Now, suppose that in a fateful vision, he imagined himself taming the entire community, so he could live at the advantage of their human energy and the bounty they had created, a shepherd of men and women.
Socrates, you shock me. What a monstrous idea.
I shock you, Hypatia? Do you not see that this is exactly what our rulers in Athens are today? And those future men with the thin scarves tied around their necks?
Ideas like that can get you killed, my friend. You should watch your tongue.
I have reconciled myself to that long ago, Hypatia. Let me continue. Suppose that with the same ingenuity that had created the town and fields, this young man and some cohorts decided to make their dream come true. It was no easy thing to domesticate plants and animals. It took thousands of years to create the tools and techniques that made that world possible. In order to make their dream come true, these shepherds of men and women would have to create new tools and techniques to domesticate their fellow human beings. In particular, they would have to create new institutions that gave them power over others. A shepherd's crook for their human flock. Agreed?
Agreed.
Then, given that human ingenuity was great enough to tame other powers of nature, surely it would be great enough to tame communities of human beings. These institutions would be the greatest tool ever created, a tool for making tools of human beings. Thus, what we saw in the time machine and what we see today is not our species acting naturally in its habitat. It is a captive creature and its captor, bound in an unnatural struggle, wreaking havoc upon the world. Hypatia, my dear, are you all right?
You have shaken my understanding to its foundation, Socrates. The institutions of power that I saw destroying the world are not human nature at all. Indeed, instead they are institutions that do violence to human nature and the world, grown mighty enough to terrify Zeus himself. Yet, once this tool has the whole world in its grip, what hope is there of stopping it?
That remains to be seen, Hypatia. Sometimes a little hope is all the gods give us. We must make do with what hope we have. But if human ingenuity was great enough to create this tool, then the human flock may yet find a way to escape its shepherds and run free again, before it is too late.
Then, what can we do to prevent this disaster, Socrates?
You and I, my dear? Nothing. After all, we are only characters in a dialogue. But those who ponder our words may work wonders that even the oracle cannot foresee. So there you have the first big idea in my theory of political power. The world is in terrible trouble today. War and the threat of nuclear war, destruction of the habitat, including global warming, huge populations crowded into cities vulnerable to pandemics, even the threat of a global corporate culture degrading the human spirit. The threat is so great that I call it the human emergency. Now, it's tempting to blame the human emergency on human nature, as Hypatia did, to think that only a malignant creature could wreak such havoc upon the world. But I think that is a fatal mistake. We are actually an ingenious and cooperative species. Only a very small part of the species is wreaking the havoc, and the havoc would be impossible without certain institutions. Would tens of thousands of men arm themselves, travel to foreign lands, and wage war if there were no nations or armies? Would hundreds of workers equip themselves with chainsaws and bulldozers to clear pristine rainforests if there were no corporations? Would they build factories and power plants that contaminate the air, land, and sea? Would half the world's population build huge cities and move there if they weren't driven off the land by those in power? I think not. The human emergency is a result of violent and destructive institutions that act contrary to human nature, the institutions we call political power. Of course, this assumes that the oracle's time machine was right. As for the future, our world today, that's clear. The men in thin scarves are running institutions that are destroying the world. But what about the past? Hasn't it always been this way? When we look at other species in nature, we see balance and harmony with the habitat. It would be extremely bizarre for one species out of countless millions to be violent and destructive enough to cause the human emergency. In fact, the archaeological evidence shows that before the Bronze Age, communities notably lacked armed central authority with privileged rulers, states, and war. That is, political power. There were no distinguished graves stocked with riches, no palaces, no temples. The communities were seldom located strategically, like on hilltops. Their art doesn't typically depict weapons and fighting. It may not have been a golden age, but compared with today's world, these communities were remarkably peaceful and egalitarian. In other words, they lived in the same balance and harmony typical of other species. The oracle's time machine was right. Our species lived this way for 250,000 years. During that time, our ancestors migrated over most of the planet, survived 3 ice ages, and advanced from subsistence foraging to agriculture. Then a dramatic change began 6,000 years ago with the so-called birth of civilization, the birth of political power. So the institutions that have caused the human emergency have only existed for less than 3% of our human family history. It has not always been the way it is today. Before civilization, communities lived in the same balance and harmony we see in other species. Again, it would be extremely bizarre for a species to suddenly mutate into something violent and destructive after living in harmony for so long. I think this dramatic change was an innovation, not a natural development like a young man's face sprouting a beard. The distinctive traits of our species are tool making and harnessing external sources of energy, especially domesticating plants and animals. To domesticate an animal means to tame it, to train it to be useful, to harness its energy for one's own purposes. These traits enabled small groups of men to domesticate entire communities of human beings. Like plant and animal domestication, this innovation required new tools, and I think political power is best understood as a tool for making tools of human beings. This idea puts things in a much clearer and more hopeful light. If the human emergency is a result of human nature, or even if it's a result of destructive institutions that inevitably develop at some stage, then there's no hope for humanity. But if human nature is fundamentally ingenious and cooperative, and if the human emergency is the result of a tool in operation, then we may be able to stop the destruction. Of course, we can't uninvent a tool once it's been invented, but we can condemn the purpose it serves and forbid its use. I'll say more about this possibility later. Now we come to the second big idea in my theory of political power. Is it only a pretty metaphor to call political power a tool? No, I think it's an accurate description, and I can spell out in detail how this tool must work. A tool doesn't have to be a physical object like an axe. Language is also a tool, and so are social institutions. They are devices that accomplish a definite purpose in a reliable way. The tool of political power is a system of institutions that work together to accomplish a definite purpose. Any tool is defined by its purpose and its operating principle. The purpose of an axe is to chop wood. The operating principle is to use a levered wedge. Without the intention to chop wood, the axe would never have existed. Given this purpose and operating principle, you can only make an axe in certain ways. You can't make the blade out of wood. This explains why all axes have similar designs. It isn't human nature that makes an axe an axe. It's the tool's purpose and operating principle. Further, any tool enables the purpose that it carries out. Once the axe is invented, more wood will get chopped. For the same kind of reasons, you can only domesticate human communities in certain ways. This explains why all power structures have similar designs. Remarkably similar systems of institutions appeared first in Mesopotamia and Northeast Africa, then in the Far East, the Indian subcontinent, and much later in Mesoamerica. It isn't human nature that makes political power what it is. It's the tool's purpose and operating principle. Further, once a tool for making tools of human beings is invented, more human beings will be made into tools. And without the intention to make human beings into tools, political power would never have existed. I think this tool is best understood as an engine, a device that converts energy into useful work. The energy to be converted is the human energy of a community. The useful work is human action that serves the authority and privilege of the rulers. And the rulers are simply the people who use the engine. Clearly, this means that the ruler's intentions must control the subject's actions, and this can only be done in certain ways. If I want you to clean my cat box, I can simply ask you to do it. If you say no thanks, then I can offer you $1 to do it. If you still say no thanks, I can pull a gun on you, or just mention that I have a gun in my pocket and I'm in a very bad mood. Or leaving the gun aside, I can tell you that if you clean my cat box, the angels will reward you with a miraculous blessing tomorrow. In other words, I can get you to clean the cat box voluntarily, with or without an incentive. Failing that, I can get you to clean it by threats or deceit. This exhausts the possibilities. Now, it would be really nice if you could domesticate a community with nothing but the voluntary cooperation of the subjects. But remember, we're discussing a tool for making tools of human beings. A tool can't say no. So the rulers must also use threats and deceit to make sure their subjects obey in a reliable way. I call these hard and soft subjugation. Hard subjugation captures the subject's energy by the threat of violence against the subject's will. Soft subjugation captures it by deceit, distorting the subject's will. Now I can define this engine by stating its purpose and operating principle. The purpose is to domesticate a community. The operating principle is to capture the subject's human energy by incentives together with hard and soft subjugation. I call the engine domination, and I call the various ways it has to use incentives, threats, and deceit, the components of the engine, like the blade and handle of an axe. It has 7 of them. Landholding by force of arms, the command structure, the destruction industry, the class structure, thought control, forced labor, and human sacrifice. The 7 components are the institutions that go together to make the tool of political power. Now, to see how these components must work, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that we're those shepherds of men and women that Socrates described, creating our shepherd's crook for the human flock. How would we have to use incentives, threats, and deceit to domesticate a community? Now, of course, domination was really invented through a long process of trial and error, like most great innovations. But the thought experiment will make clear how the final engine had to be constructed. First off, we need a community to domesticate. Where can we get one? We can't just ask for volunteers. Unfortunately, the solution is simple. All we have to do is take a community's lands by force. This captures the community because they depend on the land for life support. They're also bound to the land by kinship, tradition, and history. Then we can take our subjects' lives hostage by denying them life support if they don't comply, and we can make them provide our own life support. I call this land holding by force of arms, the fundamental component of the engine. To deny someone life support or to withhold life support from someone in need are clearly acts of violence. All political power rests on this violent foundation, from the first dominion of kings and emperors to the elaborate systems of state land management today. This fundamental component can only work with the help of 3 further ones. First, we can't hold the land and extort our living from our subjects unless we're highly organized. Military action, in particular, requires strict discipline. So we need a mechanism that transmits commands rigorously from superiors to subordinates, a command structure. And a command structure needs a supreme authority at the head of the chain of command. Until recent times, this supreme authority was usually a monarch. We can stabilize our command structure by a system of written law that puts commands and punishments in a reproducible form. Second, we need weapons to hold the land and to force our subjects to comply. If mischievous space aliens suddenly seized all our weapons, we'd be powerless. Without weapons, domination vanishes. We also need secure living quarters. We need living implements and clothing. We need vehicles. We need confinement for prisoners, not to mention luxury items. In short, we need a lot of hardware. We must therefore create organizations that produce this hardware. Since weapons are tools that destroy, I call these organizations the destruction industry. Today, the US corporate economy is essentially one gigantic destruction industry. Third, in order to get our life support from our subjects and to run the destruction industry, we need labor on demand, labor done under hard subjugation. This is forced labor. It can include slavery, serfdom, prison labor, draft labor, military conscription, taxation, or tribute. Serfdom in Europe continued for over 1,000 years. Slavery was only abolished finally early last century, so it served domination for all but 100 of its 6,000 years. The other kinds of forced labor continue to thrive today. These four components make a basic engine of domination, but we can do better. Three further components will greatly improve our engine's performance. It takes a lot of force to run a system like this, and the more force we use, the greater the chance of rebellion. We can get a sector of the community to willingly cooperate by offering them incentives, better living conditions, easier labor, even some power. This creates a class structure, with the upper classes rewarded for being loyal to us. Since the upper classes have a vested interest in the system and the lower classes don't, then we can sit back and let the classes fight each other, confident that they won't unite in a rebellion against us. Further divisions in the subjugated community can enhance this effect, especially patriarchy, confining women to a lower status than men. But we only have so much wealth to give away in incentives. And of course, we get the lion's share. If we can deceive the community into believing that we are some kind of superior beings, or that we represent the highest moral principles, then we can make them believe that it's a virtue to obey us, that we deserve our luxury, and they're lucky to be parts of such a wonderful system. This is thought control, the systematic soft subjugation of a community. Until the last 2 centuries, thought control mostly operated through state religions. In modern times, it's become much more subtle and effective through mass media and compulsory public education. One final component will complete our engine. Although the more force we use, the greater the chance of rebellion, we must use deadly force at times, if only to make its threat real. That means killing the innocent. We must justify this violence to our subjects, especially to the loyal ones. We can do this by insisting that killing can be good when we do the killing, that some people must die for the good of others when we say so. I call this human sacrifice. It can include ritual murders like those in ancient times, capital punishment, the slaughter of war, or even setting acceptable fatality rates from contamination and drug side effects. This puts the human flock in its proper place. The people must never forget that we are killers and that our human tools are expendable. Operating together, these 7 components let us domesticate a community. I hope it's clear that this theoretical engine closely resembles the way real power structures work. So the idea of political power as a tool is more than a metaphor. But that's only the beginning of the story. When you use any tool, there are unintended consequences, like the pile of wood chips when you use an axe to cut wood, or the ruined river valley when you put in a dam. If we look at the unintended consequences of domination, we'll see how the engine in action has caused today's human emergency. There are 4 kinds of unintended consequences. First, our desires and needs will eventually outgrow the community we've domesticated. There is no such thing as enough privilege and luxury. Privilege means more, and the community only has so much for us to take. Resources will be depleted. The amount of forced labor available will be inadequate. The obvious solution is to domesticate an external community, seizing its human energy and land. This is war and conquest, the first unintended consequence of the engine in action. Next, once war is underway, better weapons can mean a decisive advantage. So our destruction industry will work to create more destructive weapons along with better countermeasures against them. This is the race to destruction. And given the power of human ingenuity, it will ultimately create mythic powers of destruction, mighty enough to terrify Zeus himself, the hydrogen bomb, for example. As I'll describe shortly, the race to destruction has profoundly shaped Western history. Further, communities threatened by war must arm themselves and reorganize along military lines, which will make them resemble the regime that threatens them. That is, war will create new engines of domination, so power must intensify. More subjugated regions and populations, more effective means of subjugation. This is the third unintended consequence of the engine in action. Local regimes will expand into regional empires. Regional empires will expand into global ones. Finally, as the engine grows more powerful and the dominated regions grow larger, the habitat will pay a greater price. Natural communities live in balance with their habitats or perish. Under domination, a regime can compensate for damaging one region by conquering another. And the larger the regime, the more hardware and construction it needs, so the more damage it does to the habitat. In particular, the construction of great cities as seats of power. This is the fourth unintended consequence of the engine in action, destruction of the habitat. To sum this up, together with human domestication, the intended consequence of domination, these unintended consequences inevitably cause mass human suffering and destruction of the habitat. So again, the idea of political power as a tool is much more than a metaphor. It predicts the kinds of violence and destruction that have caused the human emergency, assuming nothing but the intention to domesticate communities. This clearly shows that human nature is not the problem. How many people does it take to ruin a party? A few small factions of men running their engines of domination can ruin an entire planet. But the story goes on. Refining any tool makes it more effective. Domination has been brilliantly refined for thousands of years, domesticating more and more people, causing more and more unintended consequences. If we had time tonight, I could show you how the race to destruction has changed the engine's design through Western history, from the Roman Empire to European feudalism, then from mercantile capitalism to industrial capitalism, and finally to corporate capitalism today. Each change followed from harnessing a new destructive source of energy. First, horsepower, then gunpowder, then the steam engine, high explosives, and finally nuclear energy. Domination is a function of its destructive potential. The greater the destructive potential, the more powerful the engine. This is very important because many people think that technology has caused the human emergency. What do we mean by technology? It's often defined as the application of science to practical affairs. But in a wider sense, technology simply means systematic ways of making and doing things. In this sense, technology is much older than our species. Homo habilis used tools, for instance, and Homo erectus used fire. Before the Bronze Age and domination, this kind of technology had created clothing, containers, buildings, cooking, musical instruments, painting, sculpture, jewelry, cosmetics, carpentry, stoneworking, brick, metallurgy, pottery, the wheel, the drill, plow, sickle, sewing, spinning and weaving, shipmaking, plant and animal domestication, irrigation, and medicine. So technology is a natural part of human ingenuity serving human well-being. But starting in the 17th century, the scientific revolution opened new horizons for technology and for the engine of domination. Those in power quickly understood that scientific knowledge could greatly serve their interests. In 1620, the English statesman Francis Bacon wrote that science should enlarge the estate of man. I beg your pardon, relieve the estate of man by enlarging the human empire. The seal and legitimate goal of the sciences is the endowment of human life with new inventions and riches. Inspired by Bacon, the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge was founded in 1660 under a charter from the King. Its first committee was devoted to consider and improve all mechanical inventions. So the Society's purpose was clearly more than the quest for pure scientific truth. In Bacon's famous words, knowledge is power, an idea that was to prove dreadfully true. 300 years later, mechanical inventions would include the hydrogen bomb, and Bacon's human empire would be the global corporate empire ruled by the United States. If technology, then, means systematic ways of making and doing things, everything depends on which people are making and doing what things and for what purposes. This unholy marriage of science and domination made technology an accessory to the destruction industry. Human ingenuity serving political power. Through the Industrial Revolution, through the 20th century, the race to destruction accelerated dramatically. The two world wars killed over 80 million people. That's twice as many as lived under the Roman Empire at its largest, more than all the previous wars in history combined. One nuclear war could kill that many people in minutes. So the race to destruction is almost at the finish line. And thus we have today's world and our human emergency. Exactly as Socrates said, it is not an expression of a violent and destructive human nature. Instead, it is the inevitable result of engines of domination working their institutional violence against human nature and the world. I hope I've made it clear that our only hope for the future is to shut the engines down. In other words, political power must be abolished. Impossible, you say? I think not. If human ingenuity was great enough to create the engine, why shouldn't human ingenuity be able to abolish it? But for this to be possible, we must clearly understand the problem to be solved. The problem is not human nature, not better or worse systems of power, not good rulers versus bad rulers. The problem is political power itself, the domestication of communities. Debating about rival systems of power is like debating about better or worse ways to have slavery. There is no good way to do it. The intention to dominate and live at the expense of the community must be condemned. The institutions necessary to carry out that purpose must be abolished. So the problem is precisely whether this can be done, and if so, how. Now, before I discuss that, what would it mean to abolish domination? Domination is a tool for making tools of human beings. Abolishing it would mean liberating people from the status of tools to the status of free men and women. Abolishing it would mean the end of armed central authority, the end of war, the end of privileged rulers living at the expense of humanity and the habitat. Abolishing domination would simply mean a world of peaceful, voluntary communities thriving in harmony with the habitat. Now, there's a word for such a world, a word that centuries of abuse has corrupted almost beyond repair, but I insist it's the right word and one we should use with pride: anarchism. Now, I don't mean anarchism as a blueprint for some utopia. I mean it as an ideal, a standard of human relations that can guide us in trying to make a better world. The standard is simply that voluntary human relations are the opposite of power relations, and that communities are best organized by voluntary relations, relations among equals, not between rulers and subjects. The Greek word anarchos means without rulers. Instead of a few living at the expense of the rest, all living for the good of all. To the extent that a community replaces power relations with voluntary ones, it moves closer to the ideal. Now, if human nature is violent and destructive, then anarchism is a fantasy at best, violence and chaos at worst. But if human nature is ingenious and cooperative, then anarchism is the only way humanity can thrive, and the way it did thrive for 250,000 years. In fact, if we define liberty as the absence of domination, then we see that liberty is just another name for anarchism. But how would an anarchist world work? Don't ask me. That's for the people of the world to decide. The idea that some people can tell others how to live is the opposite of anarchism. For 6,000 years now, more and more of the world's population has lived under domination. But even under this burden, people everywhere have adapted brilliantly and made as fit a way of life as possible for themselves. If this adaptive brilliance were freed from the burden of domination, people would create ways of living that work better than anything we've seen in ages. Anarchism simply means they should be free to do so. Now, back to the question of abolition. If this seems impossible, we must ask why. No one has ever tried to abolish domination, so this judgment can't be based on historical experience. In fact, the feeling that domination is inevitable comes from domestication. Any animal trainer knows that the animal must understand who's in charge and that there's no alternative. We've lived under hundreds of generations of human domestication now. So of course we're brought up knowing who's in charge and there's no alternative. But that is precisely domestication, to accept our captivity and learn to live under the yoke. The first and most important step is to believe that we can be free and we have every right to throw off the yoke. The feeling that we're powerless is domination's greatest weapon against us. True, since no one has ever tried to abolish domination, we don't know whether it can be done or how. But the men who created domination didn't know how to build the engine when they began either. In other words, abolition is an experimental question. We can only find out the answer by doing the experiment. And that means we have to begin a long process of trial and error, trying our best, learning from our mistakes, and trying again. but not a random process. We must first reform domination in ways that reduce the human emergency's worst threats, nuclear war and destruction of the habitat. If we work at these reforms with the ultimate goal of abolition in mind, we'll learn a lot about our experimental question. I hope you've noticed that I never mentioned government when I was discussing domination. If government means the institutions that maintain peace and order within and among communities, then domination is obviously the worst possible kind of government. Governments worldwide can be reformed to serve human well-being, not power and profit. As we work for nuclear disarmament and protecting the habitat, we can put throttles on corporate power. This will greatly reduce military conflict because most of that conflict results from the drive for profit. Economies worldwide can liberate their human energy to serve human well-being. As domination is reformed and reduced at every stage, we'll be building a better world and moving closer to the anarchist ideal. Much farther down the road, we must reform the fundamental component of domination, landholding by force of arms. The land can only be held in common for the common good or seized by force. Only when the world's lands are returned to its people will domination finally be abolished. And this can only be done by general disarmament, the demilitarization of the world. Without weapons, domination vanishes. Disarm the shepherds of men and women, and the flock will run free. So, is this just a dream? Maybe. But I believe that domination began with a dream. The dream that a few men could domesticate entire communities. And look what they accomplished. Their dream not only came true, it has almost destroyed the world. What made their dream come true? The same thing that brought our ancestors from subsistence foraging to agriculture, that brought music from the bone flute to Beethoven's knife. Human ingenuity and an effort of will sustained generation after generation. The same thing can make our dream of a peaceful, cooperative world come true. The human flock greatly outnumbers its shepherds. Ruling elites are only a few % of the population. If these tiny factions could cause so much violence and destruction, then why shouldn't we create wonders that even the oracle can't foresee? Wonders like new institutions that make domination impossible. Engines of liberation. Our rulers have only had two advantages over us, along with their weapons. First, they are highly organized. Organization gives human action a superhuman power. And second, they have always acted with a precise intention to dominate their fellow human beings. If we act with as much organization and an equally precise intention to abolish domination forever, then I'm sure we will finally succeed. Why? Because along with our greater numbers, we have one decisive advantage over our rulers. While they have always done violence to human nature, we have human nature on our side.